Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Vinyl Den, your channel for record collecting by record collectors. I'm Nick. Today I'm talking about what I consider the top 5 punk albums ever released. There's a bunch of links down below. Make sure you check them out. There's links for the Vinyl Den Facebook group, for the merch page, for the Spotify and Apple Music playlists we put together every week, and the Patreon page. Make sure you go check all that out. Of course, if you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me a thumbs up. Hit that subscribe button down below. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I release new episodes. So I've been a big punk fan, probably going on about 30 years now, and it's probably been my most loved genre of music ever since I was probably 14, 15 years old, and so this is just my top 5. I'm sure everyone out there will have their own picks, so make sure you drop me a comment down below. Let me know what your top 5 is, because I'm always interested in that kind of stuff. And this is something that was really hard for me to put together. I went through probably 15 or 20 different albums just trying to narrow down 5, and I could probably make a video next week of my top 5 would probably be different, but so I guess this is just my top 5 as of right now. But some of the honorable mentions that could have ended up on my top 5 list. The first one is what I'm sure gonna get some feedback from, because everyone always, whenever I talk about Green Day, everyone loves to hate on them. Oh, they're not a punk band, but they are a punk band. But Dookie, released in 1994, is one of those albums that really kind of got me into punk music. From there, I discovered the Ramones and Operation Ivy and Rancid, and a lot of other great punk music from the 70s all the way through the 90s at that time. But so that's one that for a while I had on my list. Just a great album. Blink-182's Untitled album from 2003. In my opinion, it's one of the best albums of the 2000s. It's a different kind of punk album, though. It's not like Blink is known for some of the kind of like goofier punk music that they had on Enema of the State, Take Off Your Pants and Jacket, Dude Ranch, those earlier albums. But their Untitled album was very different. Had some different kind of influences on there. There's some emo on there. There's some new wave on there. There's some just post-punk on there. Some alternative on there. Just they started kind of shifting into a different direction. It is still a fantastic album. Like I said, in my opinion, it's the best Blink album, and it's one of the best albums of the 2000s. Get Dead, Dancing with the Curse, came out in 2020. If you're a punk fan and you haven't listened to Get Dead, man, you are really missing out. Get Dead is doing punk like punk was in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, kind of like that heyday, kind of old school punk rock. Very different than what new punk rock is now, which is a mix of some emo and some other stuff. But straightforward punk. Get Dead, like I said, some of the best that's out there today. Misfits, Walk Among Us, from released back in 1981. For a while, it was on my list. I had it, I think, 4 or 5. Just a great album. I love the Misfits. The Misfits are also one of those bands I discovered when I was probably 14, 15, 16 years old. Really helped me discover a lot of other great punk music. So that's a great one. Bad Religion, Suffer. So that came out in 88. Bad Religion's an interesting band because I, for the longest time, would never check them out. One of my friends, his name is Corey, huge Bad Religion fan, one of his favorite bands, and for the longest time he tried to get me in the band. I don't really know why. For one reason or another, I never really listened to any of their music. And then a few years ago, he sent me Suffer for my birthday. And ever since then, man, I absolutely love Bad Religion. Man, they got some great music. Suffer is still probably my favorite album of theirs, but definitely one, if I was making an expanded like top 10, top 15 list, Suffer would definitely be on there. And then the last one from my honorable mentions is one that, if it wasn't for this album, there probably would have been no punk in the 90s. There would have been probably no third wave ska either, but Operation Ivy, Energy was the only album that Operation Ivy ever released, but beginning to end, man, it's just an incredible album. There's not a bad track on it. So number 5 is an album that was released way back in 1977, which is kind of seen as one of the peak years for punk music, and it's one of the most iconic punk albums of the 70s. Really kind of helped change the mainstream's opinion of punk music, really kind of helped push punk in a different direction. But the album is Rocket to Russia by the Ramones. When I got into punk in the 90s, like I said earlier, it was mainly those 90s bands, Green Day, Rancid, Operation Ivy. And then when I started going back, the Rocket to Russia was my like entry point into the Ramones music. And instantly I was hooked. I love this album. It's probably been one of my most played albums of the last probably 30 years. And it's an album that, is, if you go back and look at the first couple of Ramones albums, it's, I'd say equally as good, though, those first couple of albums, but the production on Rocket to Russia is a huge improvement over those first couple of albums, and that's why I think it was Rocket to Russia really kind of pushed the Ramones even further out in the mainstream. I think it was like number 49 on the Billboard 200 here in the U.S., which is big for a punk album in the 90s when you had all this other great rock music going on, but you also had some great soul and R&B and disco and all this merging of all these genres back in the mid 70s. It was this album that kind of stood out and kind of, like I said, pushed the genre of punk in a different direction. I guess I'll warn you from here on out, the rest of these are going to be 90s albums. So it's a little hint of what's coming up. But, I think the 90s, as far as punk music goes, is as great as punk was in the 70s and in the late 80s. It was really, I think, in the 90s that really changed punk music. It was when punk kind of merged with ska, merged with grunge, hard rock. All these different influences really made its way into punk, and I think really it really changed punk music in the 90s. That's I think why we got so many great albums in that decade. But number 4, album that I've loved ever since I first listened to it back in the 90s, but that album is Punk in Drublic. This was released way back in 1994. It was their 5th studio album, and I think what really changed with NoFX during this period was, so this is the second album with El Jefe on guitar. White Trash, Two Heaves and a Bean, which came out I think a year or two before this album, was his first album. So this album is really, I think, when he kind of dug his feet into the band, and when he joined the band, musically the whole direction of the band really kind of shifted. And I think from here on out, from the release of White Trash, Two Heaves and a Bean until Wolves in Wolves Clothing in 2006, it was like a string of 7 just absolutely incredible albums that NoFX released. But this is their most successful album. I think it's their most iconic album also. And that, like I said, like I'm going to say with all the other albums on here, this is one that I listen to all the time. The album I've got at number 3 is it's a really interesting album because it's not really kind of a straightforward punk album. It was released back in 1998. It charted really well. It charted number 35 on the Billboard 200 here in the U.S., but it definitely has some different kind of influences on the album than you would really expect. The album, it's a great album. The album is Life Won't Wait by Rancid. And when you listen to this album, it's different from their previous 3 albums. That this album has a little more of a ska flair on there. There's some reggae on there. There's some straightforward rock on there. There's some alternative. It's like I said, it's not just a straightforward, like in-your-face kind of punk album that you would expect from Rancid at this point in their career. And I kind of compare this a lot to that Blink album from 2003, where they kind of went in a different direction. They tried to do some things different in their music, and I think it really worked on this album. This was an album when it first came out that, to be completely honest, it took me a little while to get into. It took me maybe 3 or 4 listens to the entire album before I kind of got what Rancid was trying to accomplish on here. And, ever since then, I've absolutely loved this album. So the album that I've got at number 2 is an album that probably could have been number 1 for me. I think number 1 and number 2 are pretty interchangeable, but I think the album at number 1 is probably more of an iconic, more of an influential punk album than I've got at number 2. So I think it's kind of why and where I separated the two. But it's a great album. Came out back in 1996. The album is Destruction by Definition by the Suicide Machines. The one track on here, New Girl, was part of the Tony Hawk video game back in the 90s. So there is a track that some people might be familiar with, but if that's the only track you know off this album, you are absolutely missing out. This is a great mixture of some really great hardcore punk, some really great third wave ska. Just a really interesting blending and mixture that the Suicide Machines, I don't think were really able to redo on any of their albums that came out after. This is their debut album, like I said, came out back in '96. They've released several albums since then. I think Battle Hymns had some traction also, but never quite lived up to what they were able to do on this album. So my number one album is an album that some people might be surprised by, maybe because as much as I talk about Blank, as much as I talk about MXPX, I don't have any of their albums in my top 5, even though they do have some really great albums. But that number one album for me is such an iconic album. It was an album that really, I think, influenced punk. All the way through today, bands are still influenced by this album, and it actually did pretty well. It actually charted at 45 on the Billboard 200 when it was released back in 1995. It was the album that actually got me into punk. I still remember to this day sitting at my friend's house watching MTV, and the video for Ruby Soho came on, and I was instantly hooked on punk music from the day on. Of course, that album is And Out Come the Wolves by Rancid. I know a lot of people love Let's Go, which is the album that came out before this. I think a lot of people kind of hold Let's Go above And Out Come the Wolves, but I think there's, they tried to experiment a little bit, not as much as they did with Life Won't Wait, but they tried to experiment with their punk sound a little bit more than they did on their first couple of albums. And, Lars Fredriksson was their new guitar player on Let's Go. And I think by the time that they released And Out Come the Wolves, kind of along the same lines as when NoFX released Punk a Drublic, where El Jefe really kind of got his feet into the band on that second album. I think Lars did the same thing on this album, really kind of let his influence come through on a lot of these tracks also. And from the beginning to end, there's so many like iconic tracks on this album that to this day, I would, if I was making a ranking of the top 100 punk songs, I'd probably have at least 4 or 5 of these in the top 2025. And I think it was mainly the success of albums like And Out Come the Wolves, Smash by The Offspring, Dookie by Green Day, albums that really kind of broke out into the mainstream, that crossed genres, that pulled people into punk music in that early to mid part of the 90s, is why you saw so many different punk bands throughout the end of the 90s, even the early 2000s, that you saw so many great albums being released over that period of time. Well, that's all I got for you today, guys. Thanks for checking the show out. Make sure you drop me a comment down below, because I'd love to hear, because I'm sure I'm going to get the, Green Day is not a punk band. I'll get that comment on there. I'll get how can you not have, the Sex Pistols in your top 5. I'll get that comment, I'm sure, also. But let me know what you guys think, because it's interesting. Music is so subjective, and the punk genre, spans so many different punk subgenres, even, like ska punk and all sorts of different things that, maybe hardcore punk fans probably don't see as punk, but it is. I think punk is a big umbrella, as much as some people don't want it to be. I'm interested to see what you guys list as your top 5. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure you give me the old thumbs up, hit that subscribe button down below. That's all I got. Until next time, keep on spinning. Peace.